All right. Let me know if you can't see my screen. I have started sharing.
We can see it. It looks great.
Glorious. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Good morning, and thanks for being here today. My name is Dan McAvey. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a middle-aged white man with brown hair and glasses. I'd like to begin by thanking the faculty and staff of the MFA program, especially Ellen Mueller and Kylie Van Note, as well as my mentor, Ann Leibovitz, who has challenged, supported, encouraged, and challenged me some more in the pursuit of developing my practice over the last year and a half. Lastly, I'm grateful to my family, whose support and love are the reasons that I'm able to embark on this journey at this point in my life. In this presentation, we'll take a quick look at some of my older work, then I'll discuss some of my artistic influences, and then we'll look at more current work and consider where my practice is heading. Before I began the MFA program, I've primarily created colorful landscape paintings such as this, focused on the feeling and energy of a particular scene. Loose brush marks and visual pathways were important aspects of these works. More recently, my practice has been influenced by the abstract expressionist movement, as well as the global and personal challenges of the last 2 years. There are 3 artists who have particularly influenced my work. The first of these is Franz Klein, who was an innovator in abstract expressionism. He used black and white paint to communicate action and energy. His work loosely relates to urban landscapes, but in very simple terms. A contemporary artist that I also look at is Helen Ward, who also works primarily in black and white. Her treatment of the landscape is less abstract than Klein's, but her work is also sparse, energetic, and emotional. And then lastly, another contemporary artist is John Zurier. And again, his work is primarily monochromatic, but in contrast to the other two, he utilizes a broad palette to explore light and atmosphere in the landscape. But within each painting, he uses a narrow chromatic range. I appreciate that painters from the abstract expressionist movement worked honestly with their materials. Though they addressed various themes, they did not try to convince the viewer that the painting was anything other than paint on a canvas. This movement followed World War II, a period that involved some of the most horrific moments in history. The artist and philosopher Barnett Newman, whose work you're seeing now, stated, "We felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, a world destroyed by a Great Depression and a fierce world war, and it was impossible at that time to paint the kind of paintings that we were doing. Flowers, reclining nudes, and people playing the cello." Today, we haven't just survived a world war, but our current moment is nonetheless a difficult one. We continue to suffer through an ongoing global pandemic. Economic disparities are as great as ever. Racial turmoil is boiling over, and political differences prevent us from hearing each other. These crises have served to isolate us from one another in both physical and philosophical ways. Our perceived differences make us not want to interact with anyone with opposing viewpoints, while the pandemic tells us it isn't safe to do so. During this time, my own paintings have become increasingly simplified, both in form and chroma, but with an increased attention to the ways that paint is applied to the surface. This austerity of color gives the viewer a sense of desolation, which is an unfortunately common feeling as we work through the challenges of these last couple of years. I'm a parent to 2 school-aged children. When I started the MFA program in 2020, my kids had not physically attended school for 6 months. So a challenge of the pandemic for me was that I'd had to greatly change my art practice in order to serve as an elementary school teacher. While that was difficult for me, the time with my kids was also bonding and life-giving. Parenting was at once a challenge and a beacon. Artwork that I created during this period focused once again on the landscape, in part because outdoors was the only place we could go during quarantine. The color palette that I used for the landscape became more muted and more desolate to reflect the frustration of living under a never-ending pandemic. But within these landscapes, there were always 2 pink dots representing the pink coats my kids wore whenever we went out adventuring. In these works, the idea of a beacon shining through a difficult time was beginning to take shape. Just after this period, I created a series of paintings that referenced the perspective from a boat traveling the Mississippi River through Minnesota. To gather source material for these paintings, I traveled by boat or walked along the shores of the river, snapping photographs. These paintings were largely monochromatic, but this time in black and white. In each painting, there was a red dot to represent the red beacons on the sides and tops of many of the structures along the waterway. Some of those lights were there to help boats navigate the river, others to help planes navigate the sky and to not run into the buildings. Part of my motivation from this work stems from having trained briefly as a sailor, and many years ago, spending a month and a half at sea. From this experience, the idea of lighthouses has fascinated me. Someone on shore was making sure that a light was always burning. Someone at sea depended on this light to avoid danger and to find their way home. These two people would never meet. So they were at once isolated and yet still connected. I became engrossed with these red lights along the river's edge and how a silo or a grain elevator could function as a lighthouse, developing a notion that connection can be found in unusual places. But in more recent paintings, that red dot has been removed. I'm exploring ways that isolation can be communicated, along with a sense of longing for something that remains just out of reach, much the way that abstract expressionist painters responded to the events of their time by avoiding representational work. I strive to communicate the ache felt at the lack of human connection over these last 2 years. I accomplished this by simplifying both the shapes and palette used in my paintings. In some pieces, this ache is resolved by a colorful dot that bursts through the isolation. In others, color remains absent, communicating the continued longing for a resolution and connection. And whether resolved or not, that need for connection remains part of the work. So what we've seen so far in this conversation has been kind of a jumping off point. And those last paintings were completed in October. And since they were completed, I've been experimenting with marks and colors in different ways to manipulate a surface. I'm exploring ways that I can incorporate a greater degree of emotionality and spontaneity in my work. The paintings that you see now were all made in the last month. I've been trying to make as many odd, beautiful, energetic paintings as I can and testing out ideas as soon as I have them. A year ago, I embarked on a similar process, only at that point, I was only experimenting with white paint and finding all the different ways that I could experiment with white. And that was the precursor to the wayfinding series that you saw before, the black and white paintings. I'll continue this exploration for the rest of this month and over winter break, and then I'll take the whole lot of paintings, make observations, evaluate them, determine what's working and what isn't. Within this new work, I'm continuing to explore ways to find a path, to find connections, even when the way forward isn't always clear. So thank you for spending some time with me this morning. I'd be honored to respond to the questions, comments, and feedback that you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dan. And again, as with everybody else, while people are pulling their thoughts together and putting questions in the chat, I wonder if you might like to drop a URL into the chat for people to check out.
Another project for winter break is to finish my website. So that URL will have to be coming.
Or Instagram, either one. But I do have a question here. All right, Clementine asks, thanks, Dan. Loved hearing more about your work. Do you typically use a reference in your work, or is there a sense of remembering a scene in your mind when you paint?
A good question. Typically, I do use a reference. And in most of the paintings that I shared today, there's a photograph that I work from, but I do also work in plein air quite a bit, which is a body of work that I didn't bring to this session. That said, with that last block of paintings that were totally abstract, those were not based on a reference image of any kind, but that one was the was more just remembering a feeling, and not so kind of thinking of the paintings as being separated from anything in the physical space, but of what I'm feeling and what I'm experiencing on the inside.
Wonderful. And now we've got several questions. So our next one is from Lucas. He asks, in your work, sorry, I read that wrong. In your work, you describe your use of muted palette while choosing moments to allow for color to emerge. Do you find the moment of color or the lack thereof to be more meaningful?
Well, I think part of it is that I'm trying to give a lot of power and weight to the red dot or the pink coats, and by removing and muting all the color except for those parts, then they are being elevated in power within that, and so in that regard, it's I'm giving more strength to those moments by removing color, and so that's kind of where that's going. But then in those later paintings that were big, kind of purely black and white, then the lack of color kind of also conjures up a feeling and experience of kind of, a little bit of sadness and longing and wanting something more that isn't quite there.
Thank you. And next we've got a question from Kaylee. She asks, thank you, Dan, for such a beautiful presentation of your work. How do you approach scale in your paintings? The literal size of the canvas is what Kaylee's referring to.
Yeah. Thank you, Kaylee. Size is something that I've definitely played around with a lot. For probably the bulk of artwork that I've made has tended to be small. And some of that is just a practical matter with, before having a campus studio and working from home, having something that I could sit at a table or desk in the basement is practical, because of course I've got kids running around. And now I am exploring, increasing the sizes of the work that I'm doing. And as much as I really enjoy and appreciate the more immersive experience of being in front of something that you can't even fit it in both eyes, but there's also many practical challenges with that I'm kind of wrestling with, of how to get a painting from one place to another, and those paintings that I just finished in October, I built these beautiful structures for them and they've already warped, so it's like, oh geez. So I certainly am drawn to large works, but am wrestling with the practical challenges that they propose as well.
That is a real challenge, yes. Yin Yin now asks, morning, Dan, really great job. I really appreciate the work, diligence, and we'll look up that series. They have a clean, generalized feel and have very crisp strokes. I'm not very familiar with paint and would like to know what tool or what method was used to paint this.
Ooh, a good question. First off, most of the paintings that I've been doing, I've been working on panel, so a wood panel, which I like the rigidity that provides, and that does make it a little bit easier to make crisp brush strokes. So in virtually all cases, I am using a paintbrush, but for some of those paintings, and the ones that you mentioned specifically are kind of bigger, like 2 feet by 3 feet, and in those cases, I used a lot of masking tape. And so first drawing in the image using tape to block off edges, and then painting. And I usually started with a black panel and then painted white over it. And so that's kind of the act of taping out all those little sections is cumbersome, but also somewhat meditative in its way.
Wonderful. And then next we've got Anna asking, I really enjoyed seeing how your work has progressed, and I'm really intrigued by the notion of a beacon as a way of connection. I'm curious, now that you've had some time away from this representational notion, do you foresee this element returning in future work, or do you believe that this idea has been fully thought through at this point?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I appreciate you're considering that. I think I do think that it's going to continue to be part of the work. Those most recent ones where I'm slapping paint on a canvas, there have been some moments where that has come through. But I think that's part of what I'm wrestling with right now is in those earlier paintings, I was kind of thinking of both isolation and connection within the same piece, and the beacon provided that connection. And I'm trying to explore right now, can I paint isolation without the connection? And is that if so, then the beacon may not be present. So I'm not sure just how that will play out. So certainly I'm leaving the door open to more beacons, and I do and did do like how those came out, and am wanting to just kind of see what happens, see what plays out.
Absolutely. And I do want to allow for, if anybody needs to take a wellness break right now, feel free. Dan, there are two questions. Oh, and now there's a third. There's three questions here. Would you mind taking one or two more?
No, I would not mind. That'd be great.
Excellent. Okay, next question is from Shoshana. How does your mark making relate to the themes you explore?
Ooh, mark making is something that I've really, I think over the last year or so has become a much bigger part of my process, and really exploring the different ways that I can make marks with paint on panels or on canvas. And so one of the ways that it relates is oftentimes I work with thin paint, and so the images are built up with layers. And one of the things I like about that is that it shows the evidence of the process of making. But I also like that, especially as I'm kind of thinking about ideas of isolation and connection and such, of there being almost kind of a ghostly image that because it's underneath 3 or 4 layers of paint, there's something there, but you can't quite see what it is. It's just out of reach. And so the ways that I put paint on is useful in that regard. In that very recent batch of paintings, where I'm exploring more energetic ways to paint and trying to conjure a feeling in my head, and then slapping paint onto the canvas in ways that relates to that feeling, is a lot of fun. And even in some of the canvases, I even like took a knife and was cutting the canvases, which was kind of strange and exciting. And whether that will come back, I don't know, but it was a kind of a fun way to test some things out with the work. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for answering extra questions, Dan. And I think the two that are left in the chat are pretty big questions. One's about your teaching philosophy, and another one, it looks like Caroline Jablonowski has left it a really juicy question there. But given our time constraints, I'm going to let you respond to them individually. Maybe you can send them a message in the chat. So this way we get a little tiny break before we start with Bo at 10:45. So thank you so much, Dan. Let's all give Dan a little round of applause. Awesome.
Thank you all for being here.